everyone, and welcome to my Division 2 pre-launch impressions. So, the feeling of time melting away, of a compulsion to do just one more activity. That really is the core of a loot shooter, the strange situation where you know that a game really has hacked your brain, and for some reason you still feel okay about it. Having played a fair share of Diablo 2, 3, Reaper of Souls, and Destiny 2, I really know that feeling when a loot-driven game has got to me. Interestingly, even though it was only through the open beta, I actually found that to pretty much be the case with Ubisoft's The Division 2. Now, Division 1 launched with a whole host of issues, but the players who actually stuck with it over its patch lifetime reported a major turnaround, with that game eventually turning into one of the most complete loot shooters on the market. While I barely played it, I did spend a weekend in the high-risk PvPVE Dark Zone, thoroughly loving it. So suffice to say, I have actually been very interested in playing The Division 2, having first played through a little bit of its endgame during EGX last September. Things seemed pretty strong then, so when the open beta came around, I jumped in, and damn, I have a lot to say about it. Let's get started with the basics, because the basics of combat are executed masterfully. I don't normally enjoy this type of third-person cover-based combat, to be honest with you, but here it is executed with a slickness that really just turns into this great game of angles where you're able to seamlessly position yourself by just pointing at a bit of cover and pressing the spacebar. It's a system that's existed in other games, but here it just works near flawlessly, really allowing you to consistently execute your moves, leading to a movement system that just flat out feels brilliant to use. Of course, this game is very heavily cover-based, so it's important that that mechanic is something that works well, and thankfully for them, it really does. So, the movement system is pretty much perfect, bar maybe 4 instances in my most recent 8-hour session when it bugged out a little bit. Some games, they need to do a lot to make the player feel powerful, but here, just the basics of movement do actually give you a strong feeling of actualization, like you can make the plans in your head sort of become reality in-game. So, great cover and movement, but what about the shooting? Well, once again for me, I traditionally do not like third-person shooting. I almost always prefer first, and I still do, but the Division 2 shooting really is as good as I could hope for. The guns manage to have their own identity. A lot of that I think is also because they have their own recoil patterns. Now, not as much as with many first-person games, but definitely enough to get the job done. And this is also in large part down to how the different classes of weapons operate. SMGs are kind of like laser cannons up close, and they actually have fantastic close-range blind fire, but of course they're not great past that. Assault rifles are a great jack-of-all-trades, forcing you to use small controlled bursts at mid to long range. Then the machine guns, well, they're far more accurate when you're in cover, and they actually get more accurate over time as you continue shooting, and then also having the ability to suppress enemies. Now, of course, there's more weapons, but you kind of get the drift here. Each class of weapons feels like it has a very distinct niche within the game's combat system, and, well, different weapons within the same class of weapon still do manage to feel quite different so far. Generally, I think it's just down to good sound design, the reticle bloom and all that stuff feeling right, and the recoil patterns also being unique for the different guns. It's one of those things that's kind of hard to put your finger on, but having just played Anthem, it is remarkable how much better Massive Games' third-person shooting is as compared to BioWare's. Now, the abilities of the Division 2 are actually also quite well executed. They come in 8 broad categories being themed around their delivery method, so that's things like, say, a seeker drone, a quadcopter drone, a launcher, a turret, a big shield, and each one of those things has different variants. For an example, an explosive seeker mine, or maybe an airburst seeker mine, or an armor repairing drone versus an offensive drone, a sniper turret, or an assault turret. You kind of get the picture. Most of these combine quite well with each other, and it's especially nice to have turrets that kind of manage flanking enemies and stuff like that. Now, the skill system is certainly not as crazy as Anthem's or maybe Destiny's if you're thinking about the Destiny ults, but I think it's just right for the Division's needs and really how it slots into the game system. Then the final part of the puzzle is your specialization weapon. This is more of an endgame thing, with the ammo for your specialization weapon basically acting like an ult, really just being a resource for your team to manage. So there you go, the movement, the shooting, the bread and butter of this game. It's actually quite excellent at the core. Luckily for the Division 2 though, things actually do get a little bit better once we talk about the enemies at which you shoot. Broadly speaking, when we think about the trash enemies, there's two types. There's people who just run at you in melee, screaming blood. I mean, it's a bit corny. And then there's the people who just stay behind cover and pepper at you. Now, even this simple combination works quite well, with the ranged enemies doing a decent job at flanking around you, while the melee ones try to, surprise you and just run up to you. Of course, there's also grenades that are used to flush you out of your position. Now, speaking of grenades, you can actually shoot grenades in midair, setting them off. And if you notice a grenade being thrown earlier, then you can actually shoot it mid-throw, causing the enemy to drop the grenade, dealing AoE damage. But if you then see the grenade just, on their belt, you can shoot it on their belt, causing it to explode while it's being worn. And the same actually applies for the gas grenades, and it really is quite a cool system. Sometimes, yeah, you'll just get lucky, you'll spray at an enemy and they'll just explode, but other times you really go out of your way to exploit this mechanic, actively seeking out unique weak points on enemies. And that's especially good if you have an enemy that, say, has a daze grenade. Especially that's a more powerful enemy, and then they're stunned and you can take them down. Now, the more powerful enemies do just have a few more varieties. Typically, they will have some armor. Now, here's what's kind of cool. That armor can be shot off the enemies. So if you're able to bring down some concentrated and precise fire upon your enemy in about the same spot, you'll cut through their armor, and it will mean that they won't really feel like a massive spongy meat shield. Now, even for the largest and most tanky of foes, like for whatever reason, putting multiple clips into their armor feels fine, because you know that once you reveal their weak point, you'll be able to take them down pretty darn quickly. Now, the enemies also have other things. They've got explosive drones that, just along with the enemy variety in general, do combine to make the combat not really feel slow-paced. You really do have to keep tabs on your surroundings. You're always watching your flanks. It definitely does manage to blend tactical shooter with loot shooter, creating something that feels very different to anything else that is on the market. If you want one of these kind of infinitely replayable loot-based games. Then the final part is the level design, which so far has been quite strong, with missions usually being kind of connected combat arenas through corridors, usually giving you sort of arenas of varying layouts with different enemy spawn patterns to keep things feeling a bit fresh. As compared to Anthem, well, I'll just say this, it's refreshing to see something that has level design. Anthem's flight renders geometry basically irrelevant. Of course, that could not be further from the truth for the Division 2, and that really just is so refreshing after the time that I sunk into Anthem. Now, the same goes for the enemies with massive games, and just overall, I think having a really solid design toolkit to use across the base of this game. They've got good level design, great shooting, fantastic movement, a really good roster of enemies. Now, the bullet sponge problem might rear its head at endgame, but so far from what I've played, it all felt quite good. Now, I actually do remember playing the endgame demo in the closed beta test, and I found that it was quite weird and grindy, with us seemingly not really running into armored enemies that would have their armor be removed. It felt kind of odd, and really odd in comparison to the EGX version of that very same mission that I had played, 5 months ago. So there are definitely some concerns for endgame and bullet sponge, but I'd say that the core mechanics at the heart of this game are actually quite great. So with that, let's talk about the world. So the Division 2 takes us over to Washington, D.C., being a departure from its predecessor's wintry version of New York. Now, I actually do like the look of both games quite a bit, but I've got to admit that 2 is, well, it really is quite gorgeous. It's just a lot more colorful than its predecessor. The city can look quite stunning at times, and that's very much reinforced by strong art direction, bringing in, I'd say, some of the color that made 1 or 2 sequences of The Last of Us so visually arresting, though maybe not to that quality. The world is also a lot more populated. You've got roaming bands of NPCs, as well as some wildlife. Now sure, the wildlife does not impact gameplay, but it does elevate the world in which the gameplay takes place, which I think is important. Design-wise, well, the Washington overworld feels familiar, but probably with a bit more attention to detail once you start exploring the various nooks and crannies and the back alleys, with there just usually being a little bit more than meets the eye. Overall, I'd say that Washington, from what I saw of it, is a very well-realized game world with plenty to love, but before we get into the content of this game, I think we just need to talk about the overall structure. So basically, as a new Division agent on the scene, your main base is the White House. Past that, there are settlements. Now, each settlement has its own sort of main missions and side missions. Then you've got the different zones. Those zones have safe houses in them. Whenever you first visit a safe house, you'll reveal much of the surrounding map, giving you plenty of things to chase down, with the Division 2 having, I'd say, a fair amount of things to do in the open world. Of course, all in the name of getting better crafting materials, getting better loot, getting perk points, getting skill points. Now, I've already covered skills, but as for the perks, well, you get perk points by hunting down caches in the world, and that's mostly done through side missions. And by the time you hit level 30, you'll get all the perks and you'll have a more, I suppose, advanced character. Then so far, content is split into sort of main quest missions, then you've got side missions. I believe there is more at Endgame, with Endgame also adding in a new faction called Black Tusk, who vary quite a bit in terms of their gameplay. Now, while going through the open world, you'll also find various events, such as, say, a public execution or a propaganda, like loudspeaker. Now, they're not as strong as the public events of Destiny 2, which I think are really quite brilliant, but they absolutely beat the Anthem free-play events, and certainly, if you're running past them, they're a pretty decent thing to do. There are also control points in the world. You'll run up to them, you'll summon in some NPCs with your flare gun, and then you'll fight through a bunch of enemies, and then you'll beat back the enemy counterattack, and that'll get you access to a big room full of loot at the end. And really, the three that I did were pretty good fun, but that's mostly just because I kind of enjoyed the general just shooting things and being in cover loop of this game. So yeah, a solid world, but what about the actual quality of the missions? Well, to be honest with you, there's not much story here that's of much worth. I don't think it's trying to do that. After all, this is not a BioWare game. I mean, heck, you've got characters like Odessa Sawyer who are just they're hilarious when you look at them. I think that basically if you want a tactical name, you just go for a forename that is a city and then a surname that is a profession based one, and you just get just all of these characters feel like they were written by a 13-year-old. It's very, very bizarre. The tone of this game is very weird. I think it's knowing though, but you see this character with, she's covered in scars, got the peg leg, downing whiskey, and that's the first time you see her, and you're like, yup, this absolutely is a walking trope character. So yeah, if you're going here for the plot, I mean, it's not really trying to do that. It's not like, say, Anthem, where with Anthem, BioWare said, no, you're getting a big loot shooter, and you're also getting a BioWare story. Here, you're not getting a story, you're getting a loot shooter. And that really means that when talking about missions, the thing that matters is the mission design. Now look, it's not going to blow anyone away, but when making levels for a loot shooter, I think some granularity ends up being lost a little bit because the levels have to work for, I think, a lot of different enemies and varying balance. Now they do a very good job of things, just everything considered. Rooms have a lot of cover, but with varying arrangements, and usually a few kind of weak spots or risk areas, such as enemies having a high angle on you, or there being one or two flanking routes to your position, making it so that your teammates will have to cover you, or if you're playing solo, well, I guess you'll just feel a bit vulnerable all the time. So overall, I'd say the missions are pretty good. There's not much time wasting with them. They are all pretty darn combat focused, which I think is sensible because in reality, they kind of act as dungeons, so they do need to be highly replayable as a part of the endgame. Now, the same also goes for the side missions, basically. I'm sure there will be more to this, especially with the endgame variants once that all comes out, but so far I'd say that the PvE content has left a pretty strong impression. But of course, the Division 2 is not just a PvE game, because we need to talk about the Dark Zones. So, Dark Zones were my favorite part of the original as a concept, and while I only put a single weekend into them at launch ages ago, I actually still remember that weekend in the Dark Zone quite vividly. There have been changes since then, but most of what I liked is still preserved. So they are special PvEVP zones with now normalized gear levels and high-powered PvE enemies that drop particularly strong gear, but of course with a catch, because that gear is contaminated and you can only kind of cash it out by taking it to an extraction site to call down a helicopter to take it away. Of course, an enemy agent could just go rogue and kill you while you're waiting for that, and they could take your unclaimed Dark Zone gear, and that really is the crux of it. High stakes, risk-reward gameplay. It was utterly fantastic back then, and I think that continues, up to today. It still is really fun. Now there have been changes, like to go rogue. Now, you don't just shoot the enemy, you've got to hold in a button for a bit, which I guess does kind of limit some of the ganking, but I think it might be an okay change overall. There's also been a few additions, so stats are now normalized, but Dark Zone level matters a bit more because it gives you some new Dark Zone perks. This does mean that the more experienced Dark Zone players will have an advantage, but it's just not really a raw numbers one. Then a new addition is, to going rogue, is the Thieves' Den, so you can unlock this by basically completing loads of rogue actions like hacking terminals and killing other players. Then the den itself, when you actually unlock its location has a high-level merchant inside it, and whenever you go inside it, it will wipe your rogue status. Overall, I'd say Dark Zones are fantastic. The final item extraction, it's just such a highlight of gameplay. The tension as the helicopter comes down and all the players are eyeing each other up. Everyone's trying to work out, is this person going to hop behind cover, go rogue, and try to kill us? And it almost always results in a big bloodbath that's really fun. Overall, I think Dark Zones are probably a bit more niche than the rest of the game, but personally, I just love cutthroat shenanigans in games, so I'm absolutely looking forward to doing a lot of them on launch. Next up, though, we've got Conflict, because Dark Zones are not the only PvP mode in this game. The Division 2 is adding a new 4v4 multiplayer mode called Conflict, and so far I'd say it's rather sparse, but I think it has been able to successfully translate the Division 2's combat system into a versus PvP context. Now, it's kind of weird. When the teams are balanced, it's really quite fun indeed. The angle management and kind of keeping tabs on your team, the positional gameplay, all combined with a smooth movement, it makes for a very tactical multiplayer experience. However, more often than not, one team is just better than the other, and, it's a big clobbering. Now, mostly I was doing the clobbering, so it was fun, but I don't know how long that's going to last for. So, Conflict, I would say, is a nice aside from what I've played of it, but I don't think it's anywhere near as fully realized as, say, Destiny 2's Crucible. Next up, though, let's just talk about progression, because, of course, you're doing this for gear, lots of gear. So far, I've been, happy enough with how the gear works. I can't speak for the higher levels, but it tends to come in kind of 3-piece sets. There's like a rock climber set. I think they're all themed after like manufacturers, I suppose. And if you have multiple bits of gear from the same manufacturer, you'll unlock some additional stats or effects. So I suppose that's pretty good. It's not all surprising though. I mean, you get things like, say, headshot damage, reduced ability cooldown, stuff like that. So far though, yeah, it does the job. Weapons are fairly similar, but they do also have some ample attachment customization gameplay, but that really is most of it. It's just, getting more gear, getting better guns right up until you hit level 30 and unlock your specializations, which come with a super powerful alt-like weapon of their own. Now, I don't think that the progression is maybe as strong as, say, Destiny 2 at its best, but I think it is quite well done so far, certainly being enough to do what this game needs it to do. As compared to the Division 1, well, they've removed the old stats, instead replacing them with talents. Things like increased headshot damage, crit damage, health, armor, critical chance, cooldown reduction. It seems like a better system overall than the old game's electronics, firearms, and stamina stats. Then weapons, of course, they have their own talents as well. Now, these can be things like dealing extra damage to flaming targets, or to bleeding targets, or maybe giving you a buff when you kill an enemy, or a damage buff after reloading a weapon for a short period of time. So far, it seems like enough to keep me interested. We'll just have to see what it's like for endgame. So, overall, where does all of this stuff leave us? I think the world is better than the first game. The progression seems to be better from what I can tell, but that's tentative. The core combat loop is pretty great. The emphasis on weak points and destructible armor over massive health pools from what I've seen is great, but could change in endgame. I'd say the Division 2 manages to be a very different style of loot shooter to the rest of them, having gameplay that you just can't find anywhere else. Now, while the Division 2 is not going to launch as feature complete as, say, the Division 1 after all of its years of updates, it does seem to be a very solid foundation, but of course the main question is whether that'll be enough to keep it going at launch. The big bit of content that we haven't really tried out yet is raids, which are of course very endgame focused. Now, raids are new to the franchise, with Massive opting for an 8-player format. So far, it doesn't actually look like Raid 1 is going to be available at launch, but they have confirmed that there will be multiple raids in Year 1, so I suppose that's something that's kind of promising. And overall, I'd say, yeah, it's decently promising. I could certainly see the mechanics of the Division working quite well in a raid format, but we'll just have to wait and see how well they execute on it. Really, it's hard to be Nostradamus over, the end game for all of 2019 for this game, but we do actually know a fair bit about the game's life, with Massive posting a roadmap. So over this year, they're going to launch 3 episodes. The first one's called DC Outskirts. It adds new areas and new story. Then the second one, I think, pretty much does the same, but is themed around the Pentagon, and the third one is in an unknown location. and they're going to be available for free just as a base part of the game. They're not a part of the Season Pass, but if you do get the Season Pass, it gives you 7-day early access to that content, instant unlocks of new specializations, with Massive saying that they're going to add 3 of them throughout year 1. Then the Season Pass also includes unique cosmetics, I think 8 story assignments, and additional bounties and projects. It's, you know what, it's a little bit odd, but it certainly is better than, say, the Destiny model, where, yeah, you need the Season Pass basically to keep up with the game, and Destiny 2 really is quite expensive. So far, I'd say that it seems like they have the right idea, but this is a pre-launch video, so I'm very hesitant to strongly recommend anything. Personally, I'll say this: I've liked what I've seen enough to pick this game up at launch, so that's what I'm going to do whenever it comes out. I can't make any firm recommendation because I mean, that's up to you to decide based on what you have thought of my thoughts and those of other creators on the internet. So yeah, there you go. That is my personal thoughts on this. If you'd like to hear my thoughts on Anthem, my review on that, then you can check that out, and be sure to be subscribed to the channel because there will be coverage of the next season of Destiny 2, as well as my review of Metro Exodus, which I've been technically working on for way too long, and yeah, it's just taken a while to get that one out. So anyway, I guess keep tuned for that. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I will see you next time.